Good evening. Can you hear me? Good, good. All the way in the back? Probably okay, all right. You can all be seated. No, we got a few stragglers coming in, that's all right. So my name is Stefan Boatwright. I am a representative of the Left Forum Board. It is my job to welcome you to Left Forum 2016. Thank you all for coming. You're sure that this is going to be a wonderful forum. I attended my first forum in 2010, just like many of you as a spectator. It was a really amazing forum. I saw Dr. Cornel West almost blow the podium into the audience when he was so animated. I knew that it was something I wanted to be a part of from that very moment. So during 2011, when I started my doctorate, I joined up with the forum. Back then we were talking about Occupy Wall Street. 2016, we are talking about a democratic socialist gaining millions of votes throughout the country. Times are definitely changing. One thing that's definitely changed, and maybe not for the better, is that prices in New York City continue to ravage the working and middle classes, and unfortunately, the Left Forum as well. So back in 2011, when I was an intern, we were completely unpaid. When people asked me what my compensation was, I said an infinite supply of pretzels, Twizzlers, and Marxist good vibes. That, unfortunately, is still the condition that we are in today. So all of you have been given some different envelopes on your seats, and that is us asking you to open your hearts, your minds, and of course your wallets to contribute to the forum. Now, we know that fundraising is very difficult. You need to be innovative. You need to be creative. I, unfortunately for you all, am neither of those things. So I'm going to blatantly rip off a very successful grassroots campaign fundraising scheme in the nation right now. It goes like this. The Left Forum does not accept contributions from millionaires and billionaires. We have no super PAC. We are relying upon millions, and when I say millions, I mean dozens, of campaign contributions from folks just like you. And in all sincerity, those contributions go to wonderful things. I'm going to share a little bit of Left Forum gossip with you. I'm a very good source for Left Forum gossip. Because of the growing influence of the forum, we have been approached from activists and leaders from across the nation, asking us if they can do forums in their city. So we are now sincerely talking about extending the Left Forum outside of just New York, in addition to the conference we have here, to other East Coast cities. In fact, there's even the conversation of bringing Left Forum all the way to California's Golden Coast. So we consider these things great successes, but of course we can only do them depending on the contributions from all of you folks. But enough about money, it's just too capitalist for me. So I want to kick this off with a little bit of fun, and that is going to start with slam poet Matt Cedillo. He is a revolutionary poet from Los Angeles, California. He has been featured in the LA Times. He was on KPFR radio. Please, Matt Cedillo.
So, rage, rebellion, revolution, right? That's the theme? Here we go. It's for you, Roxanne. Sundown, Levittown, Fort Apache, Dirty Harry, John Wayne, Blackface, Minuteman, Moynihan, Gone with the Wind, Breaking Bad. Washington, Redskin, Confederate flag, the sword, the dollar, the cannon, the scholar, the cavalry, and the Ivy League history is written by lightning as the rising smoke of burning village. The ways and means which victors keep their victims, a frontier thesis and notes on the state of Virginia, extraction, expansion, the Winnie of the West, Lewis and Clark Smith and Weston now circle the wagon with bloodshed and slave sweat, the crack of the whip, the law 3/5, the crown republic of King Cotton, the intended failures of Reconstruction, the housing covenants that created great migration, that same to the Mexicans in poor Mexico, so far from heaven and so close to Monroe Doctrine, to Davy Crockett, to prison industrial complex, a war on drugs is a war on a young, bloody Christmas, reefer madness, 15 to life for 4 ounces, East Oakland, West Baltimore, South La Brea, and Oliver, North Plymouth Rock, Jamestown, and the Rio Grande, stolen lives, stolen land. Here's a nation, package complete. Police, escorts, skinheads, and hooded Klansmen to march hate down public streets. Well, those very same police quote us to meet, cannon fire on black boys in hoodies and Mexican kids with shaved heads. They are killing our kids. Well, half the nation applauds in the homeland's defense because they think that a white woman's purse has more value than a black or brown boy's life. Here's a nation, hell-bent, 1%, genocide pipeline from underfunded schools to overcrowded prisons, in which our kids ain't fit for nothing but a life in and out of the system, stripped of innocence, guilt by birth certificate students, quotas before children, suspects before students, young girls, whores before victims. Here's a nation that eats its young. This is not a democracy. This is not a republic. This is an open-air prison. An industrial-scale plantation. Anything and everything you've ever gotten from this system has been a mathematical assessment. A calculated equation set to the algorithm, the cost of doing business. Keep your hands moving, stomach consuming, mind functioning with narrow confines of your job description. Blood-soaked country, forged in genocide, built on slavery by a den of thieves, posing as Messiah, the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson Davis, white Jesus, Western civilization, civilizing mission accomplished, manifest destiny, American exceptionalism, peculiar institution, institutionalized racism, declaration, to plantation, anthem, to slave ship, the bicentennial, you're back to the slave with the feet of Lady Liberty, the dirt poor, dead, tired, huddled child, lived in poverty tenements of Ellis Island, Arizona's blood red, coyote trails that traffic in brown flesh, brick by brick, grave by grave, inch by inch, slave by slave. Here is a nation, there are its chains, keep you in place, watchtower, overseer, agent killer, union bust, McCarthyism, patriot act, acting in, of national defense. Which of you would stand against it? Which hunt for whistle blown? Who said that? Who did that? Which side are you on? Here is the firing squad. They killed Metacomet, they killed Tecumseh, they killed Murrieta, they killed John Brown, they killed Nat Turner, they killed the Rosenbergs, they killed Sacco and Vanzetti, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, they killed Rupert Salazar, they killed Fred Hampton. They're going to kill in much the same fashion. Here are the blood-soaked fields that claim the life of Eddie Lopez, Presidio Flores, Susie Pena, Mike Brown, LaTosha Harlins, Trayvon Martin. Half the nation applauded. Here is that nation. This is not a democracy. This is not a republic. This is the state of the union. They are killing our children. We are at war. This is a call to arms.
Mazzadio, everyone, Mazzadio. Thank you, Matt. Now, of course, the Left Forum would not be able to be here today if it wasn't for the good folks lobbying on our behalf at John Jay. So everyone, we are going to bring up Gerald Markovitz. He is a distinguished professor of history at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He received his doctorate from the Department of History from the University of Wisconsin, has been teaching at John Jay since 1970. He has written extensively about the ways corporations have undermined the environment and the health of both workers and our communities. Gerald Markovitz, everyone.
Well, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you on behalf of the students, the faculty, the staff, and even the administration of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And of course, you know we are part of the great City University of New York. And yes, who is here from the City University? Alumni, students, faculty, yes, way to go, way to go. And you know, and all of you know, that we are in the midst of a war against public higher education. This is a war that we are engaged in, we are fighting back against, and we are winning some of the battles, but the war goes on. And we have to really emphasize that when the state does not fund public higher education, this is not an economic decision. This is a political decision that is reflecting on our students. And they are making this political decision because our students are predominantly students of color, students of the working class, students who are immigrants or children of immigrants. And we are in the midst of a tremendous fight back against that. Part of that fight back has been successful. The Students and the Professional Staff Congress, our union, was successful in stopping any tuition increase this year by the state legislature, a great victory. But the faculty and staff have been working without a contract for 6 years now, working without a raise for 6 years. And just this past week, the union had a vote of its membership for whether we should authorize a strike to be called by the union leadership. And I am proud to announce that 92% of those who voted for a strike authorization. But we need your help, we need your solidarity, we need you to join us in this defense of public higher education. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Markowitz. Last but not least, your host for the evening, a woman who needs practically no introduction. Ms. Laura Flanders is the executive producer and host of The Laura Flanders Show. She was the founder and host of Grit TV with Laura Flanders. Her books include Bushwomen, Tales of a Cynical Species, and Blue Grit, True Democrats Take Back Politics from the Politicians. And she's also available on podcasts. Please give a warm welcome to Ms. Laura Flanders.
Thank you. Let's hear it for all the organizers and participants of Left Forum 2016. That's you. We're here to take on one particular part of the conversation at the Left Forum this weekend, capitalism and militarism at humanity's peril. Now, I would say when we have a former Nobel Peace Prize winner, Barack Obama, awarding a Distinguished Public Service Award to Henry Kissinger, our humanity is more than at peril, and it tells you a thing or two about the Nobel Prize. But there's other news to discuss as well. We have the first Muslim mayor elected in London. We have 2.4 million people contributing to the Bernie Sanders campaign. A man who has not forsworn the use of drones. We have Donald Trump proving that, in case anyone wondered, white supremacy, white male patriarchal supremacy is alive and well and deadly. And we have an election on our hands while we try to build a movement that will move beyond this electoral morass. I don't need to tell you that capitalism today is characterized by massive and increasing inequality. In case you forgot, Oxfam earlier this year reported that 62 people own the same wealth as half of the world. That's 3.6 billion with a B people. And only 9 of those 62 are women. Wealth and power accumulates at one pole, while misery, austerity, and ecological degradation cluster and explode at the other. Having exploited native land and enslaved people, now it seems to be war and empire that are keeping capitalism on life support. Thank you for the poem entry beginning. We see it in the US in the rise of racism and fear and the way local police forces are armed with surplus military weapons, in the use of public funds to procure mercenary corporate security forces and enlist working class people to fight each other. Goaded on here and internationally by divide and conquer surveillance techniques and inflammatory rhetoric of white supremacy. On my program, The Laura Flanders Show, which you can see on Telesaur English or Telesaur, or just tune into our podcast at lauraflanders.com, people regularly reflect about where we've come to. Most recently, Jeremy Scahill, no stranger to all of you, considering the legacy of Plowshare's peace activists, Phil and Dan Berrigan, recalled that our movements have become increasingly separated. Racial justice from economic justice, war and peace from wages and migration dreams. From the time, Scahill recalled, when Black Power activist Stokely Carmichael called Phil Berrigan the most dangerous white man alive. We've come a long way. How are we now to understand the connections? And I think that's the challenge of this evening's plenary, is trying to understand the connections between, for example, extreme policing and mass incarceration, and extreme pilfering and profiteering and resource extraction. Most importantly, we're going to talk about where the cracks are in this system, what peace movements, what peace and justice movements are developing and how they are tackling empire, what kinds of leverage, both in and beyond the military-industrial complex, do workers and others actually have to disrupt the onslaught of militarization, and where is this leverage being used to build alternatives? On my show every week, we look not just at what's going wrong, but what is going right. We call it, the show, the place where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. So I can tell you that we're going to hear from three people who we have pretty often on the program, and I know that they are not just perfect when it comes to talking about the onslaught that we're up against, but also when it comes to talking about the opportunities and how and where people are grabbing them. We're going to get substantive, meaty presentations by each of our speakers, and then have a little conversation amongst ourselves, and then release us all to engage one another in one-on-one conversation, or cluster in groups if you prefer. Our first speaker today is going to be Chris Hedges. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author, most recently of Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. He was a National Book Critics Circle finalist for his book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. He's taught at Columbia, NYU, Princeton, the University of Toronto. He's teaching courses through Rutgers University to prisoners at a correctional facility in New Jersey. And he is about to launch a new television show on Russia Today. Chris Hedges. Wait. I'm going to introduce everybody. I just wanted them to applaud you. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of the women-led peace group Code Pink and the co-founder of the human rights organization Global Exchange. She's the author of 8 books, including Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, and her articles appear regularly in outlets such as the Huffington Post, Common Dreams, Alternate, The Other Worlds, and Telesur. Her forthcoming book is on Saudi Arabia. Medea Benjamin. And finally, Tariq Ali, my colleague at Telesur, where he hosts a weekly program. You can find out more at telesurenglish.tv.net. He was born and raised in Lahore. He came of age in London as an opponent of the Vietnam War. Today, he is editorial director of the London publishing house Verso and on the board of the New Left Review, where he's also an editor. He's the author of too many books to mention, fiction, nonfiction, and essays. The most recent of those last is The Extreme Center, A Warning. Let's start with Chris Hedges.
Thank you very much. So when I came in, I was handed a broadsheet that pulled a quote, a half of a quote that I made. And so since I want to talk about the nature of power during this electoral campaign, I will finish the quote. I did indeed say it is not our job to take power, but it didn't end there. It is our job to make the powerful frightened of us. That is what movements do. Movements keep power in check. And as any good anarchists will tell you, power is always the problem, no matter who holds it. This is a realization that Karl Popper made in The Open Society and Its Enemies, where he wrote that it is not the job to get good people to rule. That, Popper says, is the wrong question. How do we get good people to rule? Rather, it is to create a system where those in power are frightened of us. Yes, we certainly want to push forward into power those who will listen, but without those movements, without the power of movements to keep the powerful in check, all power becomes despotic. And this was an understanding that Julia Benda had in his great book, The Treason of the Intellectuals, where he said that all of us who care to create a society based on justice, a society that takes care of the vulnerable and the weak among us, that expresses compassion, are given a choice between choosing two sets of ideals: privilege and power, or justice and truth. But as Benda writes, the more we make concessions to those who serve privilege and power, the more we diminish the capacity for justice and truth. And we just finished a session on Rosa Luxemburg, who I think of all revolutionary theorists probably understood this the best. It is important that we rebuild these movements now, movements that have been destroyed consciously in the name of anti-communism, especially at this crisis moment within the American political and economic system, where we are teetering on the brink of a very frightening form of proto-fascism. One of the mistakes that Bernie Sanders made, a mistake that Shama Sawan and I called him out on before he announced his campaign, was the decision to run within the embrace of the Democratic Party. And we are now watching Bernie Sanders supporters, and I think arguably Sanders himself, confront the fact that this has been a rigged system. That when you have a system, let's not forget, by the way, that the cost of running the primaries is paid for by the taxpayer. And yet the primary rules are determined by the Democratic Party, so that they can manipulate a system as they did in Nevada to steal the vote from Sanders. They lock out independents. This is why in that last cycle, Sanders only won Rhode Island. That was the only state in which independents were allowed to vote. You have a system of superdelegates. You have money from super PACs. It's very clear that without all of these mechanisms, Sanders would win the nomination. And yet, through this long process, we have been given palpable evidence that democracy within the United States is a facade. And we are about to enter an electoral process with two presidential candidates who have the highest negativity ratings in American history, Donald Trump being number one and Hillary Clinton being number two. And those of us who care about recovering agency within our country, overthrowing the corporate coup d'etat that has taken place, and just for Homeland Security, who might be here tonight, let me repeat that word. That's called overthrow. We are going to have to step outside that system and build movements that resist. We are going to have to free ourselves from the insidious mantra of the least worst, because it doesn't work. Every election cycle, we're fed the mantra of the least worst, and it gets worse. Because our two-party duopoly, while it has a different rhetoric, serves the same centers of power. And that is why on all of the major structural issues there has been complete continuity between George W. Bush and Barack Obama, with the caveat that Barack Obama's assault on civil liberties has been worse. And I speak as a plaintiff in a lawsuit that I brought against the president over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. This is a provision that overturns the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act that prohibits the military from carrying out domestic policing. And much to the chagrin of the Obama administration, We won in the Southern District Court of New York. And Judge Catherine B. Forrest, in a very lucid opinion, explaining her ruling, 112 pages, said that what this act does is empower the government to criminalize an entire category of people and detain them without due process. And she brought up the plight of the 110,000 Japanese Americans who were detained in World War II. Because this section authorizes the U.S. military on the streets of our cities to carry out extraordinary rendition against U.S. citizens, deny them due process if the state deems them to be a terrorist, and holds them indefinitely in our black sites, including our offshore penal colonies. And the 2-year legal process, the Obama administration immediately appealed. They immediately appealed. The day of the ruling, they went into Judge Forrest's chambers, and they demanded that she lift her temporary injunction in the name of national security. And when the federal attorneys came in, they now came in with attorneys from the NSA. And Judge Forrest, to her credit, refused. That was on a Friday afternoon. At 9 a.m., they were in the Second Circuit or the Appellate Court of New York, demanding the same thing, and unfortunately, the Second Circuit agreed. Why? The lawyers Bruce Affron and Carl Mayer and I wondered why. Why? We knew they'd appeal, but why were they so aggressive? And the only thing that we could surmise is because they are already using the law. There are already dual nationals, Pakistani U.S. nationals, being held in black sites. And if they could get out, and if they could get legal representation, the government would be held in contempt of court. And what was the response? The Second Circuit, it's a panel of judges, they review the case, they wouldn't rule for months. And during that time, the lawyers went to Nancy Pelosi and they said, because this provision is renewed every year, all you have to do is insert into the provision that U.S. citizens are exempt. And of course, they did not, because it was written for U.S. citizens. And so what does the Second Circuit do? It doesn't want to rule on the merits of the case because it's patently unconstitutional in the way that our evisceration of privacy is unconstitutional. And it essentially was another example of how the courts have become wholly owned subsidiaries of the corporate state and revoked constitutional rights by judicial fiat. What they did was wait for a Supreme Court ruling called Clapper versus Amnesty International. And I was a plaintiff in that ruling. This was challenging the government's wholesale surveillance before the Snowden revelations. And the federal attorneys got up, the government attorneys got up in the Supreme Court and said that I and the other plaintiffs did not have a right to bring the case because the idea that the government was watching us was speculation, and they added, if the government was watching us, they would tell us. So the Supreme Court, buying this argument, threw it out. And then the Second Circuit said, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama. Our cert, our petition to the Supreme Court was turned down in its law. This is all under Obama. It's Obama that's used the Espionage Act to destroy whistleblowers who once sought out independent journalists to expose corruption, malfeasance, and crimes against government. And here we must honor two of our greatest whistleblowers, Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange. And Edward Snowden. And if you don't have a third-party option, then I would encourage you to just write in Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden. Let me talk a little bit about what's coming. I think Sanders made a disastrous mistake. I understand his logic. When Shama and I asked him, or encouraged him to run as an independent, he answered, I don't want to end up like Ralph Nader. And what he really said is, I don't want to take on the Democratic Party establishment and become a political pariah. Because Sanders has played, I think, or built a very Faustian bargain with the Democratic Party. He campaigned for Bill Clinton in 92. He campaigned for Clinton in 96 after NAFTA, after the destruction of our welfare system. And remember, under original welfare guidelines, 70% of the recipients were children. After the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill that exploded the system of mass incarceration that I want to address a little bit at the end. The deregulation of the FCC that turned the airwaves over to roughly a half dozen corporations. All of this was Clinton. In 2004, Sanders was calling on Nader to suspend his campaign. Sanders has always served as a kind of watchdog for the Democratic Party, and in return, they have not mounted a serious campaign to unseat him in Vermont, and he, in turn, has done everything he can to stymie third-party movements in Vermont. I think Sanders honestly believed that he had a chance. I think we are watching now a legitimate anger on the part of Sanders and those around him as they understand that the game was fixed from the beginning. And yet, I fear that Sanders will do what he says he's going to do, which is endorse the Democratic nominee. And at that moment, Sanders becomes an impediment to social change. If Bernie Sanders does not want to build a third-party movement, then we are going to have to build it without him. And we are going to have to free ourselves from this belief that we are going to make serious social change within the confines of a particular electoral cycle. We are going to have to begin to organize and recognize that what we are building towards may be 10 years away. When Syriza began, it was polling 4%. By the time Syriza took power, it had a majority within Greece. We have to hold fast to that moral imperative. We have to stand up and be willing to defy the system. We have to step outside of the system. And the system will be ruthless in terms of its response. But we are reaching a moment, a convergence of deadly environmental degradation, breakdown. We're already watching it. Many of the refugees and migrants that are streaming into Europe, yes, there's war, but there's also tremendous drought in Syria. And this system is incapable of responding in a rational way to the degradation of the environment caused by the fossil fuel industry, and let me not forget the animal agriculture industry. Wall Street has been unleashed once again with money that has been given by the Fed at roughly 0% interest. And so at some point, we are going to see another financial crisis that may be twinned with an ecological crisis. And at that point of breakdown, within a system that is incapable of responding, except to further enrich and empower a global corporate elite, you will have large segments of the population. We are witnessing this at the moment in Europe, turning to these proto-fascist forces that are embodied in figures like Trump. Richard Rorty, in his book, Achieving Our Country, it was the last book he wrote, warned that the inability of self-identified liberal elites to respond to the suffering of the underclass, while it continued to speak in the language of diversity and multiculturalism, was actually empowering the nativist, racist, homophobic forces that are gathering around Trump. Why? Because they redefined empowerment What did feminism become? Not empowering oppressed women, the way Andrea Dworkin called us to do, but by having a woman president or a woman CEO. And that lie, which was perpetuated by liberal elites, because the assault on people of color has been far more draconian than it has been on the white working class, allows demagogues like Trump to sell a message to dispossessed whites that they have been disadvantaged or disenfranchised because entitlements have been given to other marginalized groups. And the lie of our liberal elite has essentially come back, a kind of blowback against them. If Hillary Clinton becomes president, a political figure who embodies everything on each sides of the political spectrum we have come to detest, then you may get rid of Trump, but you will vomit up somebody even more vile. And the only way that we're going to be able to break the back of this rising proto-fascist movement tied to the gun culture and the Christian right is to build a viable left that holds fast to the moral imperative of defending the interests of working men and women in this country, and is willing to be pushed outside of power for a certain period of time, rather than dilute or give up that moral imperative, which is something, by the way, that Rosa Luxemburg understood. And it's we who have to do it. And if we don't do it, then we are going to see ourselves slide into a very frightening form of despotism, one where a state or a system of neoliberalism, which has lost all credibility, is forced to maintain power by carrying out increasingly more vicious and brutal forms of violence. This is something Hannah Arendt understood in Origins of Totalitarianism when she wrote about the stateless, which is essentially what people of color in marginal communities are, stateless. They have no rights. They have been taken from them. Police serve as judge, jury, and executioner. And I teach, as you heard, in a prison I just finished teaching Sheldon Wolin's great work, Politics and Vision, to my class. 94% of the people in our prison system never had a trial because the system is designed to deny them a trial. In fact, the students I teach who have the longest sentences went to trial, and they were punished for it because they stack charges against you and then they barter like a poker game. But if you go to court, all of those charges are arrayed against you. And they have to give you a longer sentence because they use you as an example. They say, look, he went to trial or she went to trial, and that's the sentence they got, so you better take the sentence we're offering. You can understand the awful dynamics of the corporate state by looking at what it does to the most vulnerable among us, and the best place to do that is in a prison where corporations have reached their deadly tentacles down to every facet of prison life. Global Tellink, which has taken over the phone services, and let's remember, the phone is the primary way that children remain in contact with their incarcerated parents, is 4 to 5 times higher than what we pay. Commissary has been privatized, and prices have ratcheted upwards. In New Jersey, you make $28 a month for 40 hours a week. It's neo-slavery. It's alive and well. And prices are now beyond reach. You are no longer given shoes. In the state of New Jersey, you have to spend $45 for a pair of Reeboks. If you send a money transfer through JPay, it's privatized. So you send $20, you get a $4.95 service fee. On and on and on. Fees are now imposed on you in prison For instance, if you have a bereavement visit to someone who's dying, or you visit a member of the immediate family who's dead, in 15 minutes you get. You pay for the guards, the overtime. It's $900. So my students are getting out of prison thousands of dollars in debt. And when they get out of prison and thousands of dollars in debt, as ex-felons, they can't get jobs, one, because there aren't any jobs, and two, because they're demonized. And if they can't maintain those payments, they go right back into prison. And that's why that guy who got stopped for a taillight runs and is shot in the back. Some people say the system of mass incarceration doesn't work. No, they're wrong. It works just the way it's designed to work. It works because we have created, with the loss of our manufacturing base and the assault on our working class, a group of surplus labor who their brown and black bodies do not generate an income for corporations until they are locked in cages where they can generate $40,000 or $50,000 a year. And the students I teach understand that reform is not going to come from state legislatures or from Congress. Because Corrections Corp of America and they've all got their lobbyists there writing the legislation. Go on Corrections Corp of America, the largest for-profit prison complex in the country, and on the website it says we are a good investment because there is 67% recidivism rate in the United States, which is why there are no programs, vocational, educational, any other programs. And they understand, as they have done, and I will close with this, that the only mechanism left is to carry out nationwide work stoppages within those prisons, because no prison can operate unless you have prison labor. And that is an example for all of us. They just carried one out in Alabama, in Georgia, on the anniversary of Attica on September 9th. They're organizing a nationwide prison stoppage. And as they have said over and over, don't go demonstrate in front of a courthouse. When we carry out that work stoppage, come to the parking lot of the prisons and stand with us. And let us all follow their example. Let us understand that if we mobilize and stand up and begin to disrupt this system, we can take power back into our own hands and eventually build in the years ahead towards the destruction of the corporate state. Thank you.
So I love Chris, but I don't know that I agree with you about Bernie Sanders, that he should have run separate, because I think he's done an amazing thing within the Democratic Party, which is get a lot of young people engaged and educate millions and millions of Americans about the tremendous economic disparity in this country. Talk about issues of mass incarceration to people who haven't heard that before, incorporate the issues that Black Lives Matter has brought to him, and also show the tremendous split in the Democratic Party. And if Bernie hadn't run, you wouldn't see that there is, on one side, a Democratic Party that's represented by Hillary Clinton and Wall Street and the weapons industries and all that's wrong in this country. And the other side are people who really want to see the Democratic Party represent their values, and those are values that Bernie Sanders is standing for. So, raise your hand if you've worked on or voted for Bernie. Raise your hand if you plan to vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, you might see that's just a very small sprinkling here. Raise your hand if you plan to vote for Jill Stein. Wow. Raise your hand if you plan to vote for Gary Johnson, the Libertarian. Raise your hand if you plan to vote for Donald Trump. We got one gentleman over there, one over there. So it's fascinating times in this country. It's a fascinating time to be with a group like this. And it's a fascinating time to think about the opportunities that we have now and that we're going to have next January. First, I want to just summarize what has happened to the peace movement under Obama. Now, let's remember that Obama came to power because he beat Hillary Clinton, and he beat Hillary Clinton, why? The Iraq War. The Iraq War. He was perceived as a peace candidate, and that's how he became president. Now, let's give him a credit for a couple of good things, really good things that have happened in these last 7+ years. One is the Iran nuclear deal, incredibly important, done against great odds, with the help of a lot of people in this room, I'm sure, but going up against big lobby groups like AIPAC, going up against Israel, going up against a lot of powers that did not want to see this go through, and it won. And the other is Cuba. Let's recognize that Obama did an amazing job opening up to Cuba. There's still a lot to be done. The embargo still exists. But let's recognize these are two diplomatic successes that happened under his administration. But also, let's not forget, they did not happen while Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. They happened after Hillary Clinton left and John Kerry came in and acted more like a diplomat. So those are two positive things that have happened. But there have been so many bad things that have happened on the foreign policy front. Let's remember that this peace president, as Laura Flanders said, who got the Nobel Peace Prize, did not get us out of the wars of Iraq or Afghanistan, has bombed 7 countries at least, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and Syria, has not closed Guantanamo as he promised. In fact, instead of closing Guantanamo, he would have been embarrassed to put more prisoners into Guantanamo, and his answer was instead to use drones to just kill people instead of capturing them and imprisoning them. And so he became the drone commander-in-chief that has spread this horrendous technology, not only being used in the United States, but is spreading it to many other countries around the world. He didn't close the over 800 military bases we have overseas, in fact, has been involved in building new bases. And in case anybody hasn't noticed, all of this militarism has not led to a decrease in terrorist groups, has only led to a spread and a change of name from things like Al-Qaeda to the Islamic State. Trump, on the other hand, is saying, we gotta rebuild the military if I get elected. As if the military needs something like more money. $632 billion, the budget this year, obscene amount of money, but that even hides other monies that are not considered with the Pentagon budget, that if you put them together, like Veterans Affairs, money from the Energy Department that go to nuclear weapons, you add all of that together, it's about $1 trillion. Not only is it 54% of all of our discretionary money, but it's more money than the rest of the world combined. We have the most grotesque military in terms of our taxpayer dollars, and guess what? They can't win a war. And that's not because they're underfunded, it's because they're sent to fight in unwinnable wars that we have to get out of. Let's not just blame it on Barack Obama. Let's look at Congress. I live in Washington, D.C. now, and unfortunately, I get to see it up close and raw when you go into these congressional hearings, and you see these Congress people from the Democrats and the Republican side falling over each other to give more money to the Pentagon than the Pentagon even asked for. And when the Pentagon wants to close a base here and there, Congress says, oh no, you couldn't close that base, it's in my district. It will mean jobs. And when the Pentagon says, oh, we don't need those C-17 planes anymore, they're old, they're not useful, the cargo planes, the Congress says, oh no, we couldn't possibly kill that program, it would mean 35,000 jobs, and it would be in my district. And of course, the weapons manufacturers know this game all too well. It is their game after all, and they make the parts of their weapons in as many congressional districts as possible. Take the most expensive weapon in the history of the world, the F-35, made in pieces of it in every single congressional district. And the weapons manufacturers then give money to the Congress people in those districts, so the Congress people keep pushing those weapons, and the Congress people turn around and they don't say, of course, oh, we have to keep these weapons going so I can get money for my campaign. Instead, they say, jobs, jobs, jobs. Now, what an insane way to have a jobs program. After all, the military is probably the only job creation program we have in the United States. Millions of people are employed in active duty and reserve, millions and millions more for feeding the military machine. And it is, you know, Fareed Zakaria, who's I don't think you would call a socialist, he's a pretty mainstream economist on CNN, writes in the Washington Post, he calls the US military the largest socialist economy in the world. He says it's cradle to grave socialism. You get your money, you get your early retirement, you get your pension, you get health care for your entire life and your family, you get free housing, you get daycare, you get early retirement, you get goodies from movie theaters to golf courses. It is indeed a jobs program. The former Secretary of State, Robert Gates, said, I don't know if he was boasting, but he said there are more members in the military marching bands than there are in the entire State Department Foreign Service. An insane jobs program, making things that make us unsafe, nothing we need to live. They don't make food, they don't make things for us to wear, to house ourselves, they don't provide infrastructure for us, nothing that we as consumers need. It's not even a good job creation program if you look at the studies that are done that showed when you put $1 billion into providing jobs in the military, you get about 11,000 jobs. If you put it into education, you'd get 29,000 jobs. If you put it into anything else, you would get more jobs. In fact, I don't think they counted this one, but I would be pretty sure if you took all that money and dropped it from airplanes onto people, that they would create a lot more jobs than the military would create. And it doesn't keep us safe. As I mentioned, there are more groups that would like to attack us than there were before. ISIS is indeed a threat. We just see probably a terrorist attack on the plane that came down going from France to Egypt. But let's remember what Martin Luther King said at the time of the Vietnam War stands true today. The US is the largest purveyor of violence in the world. And it's not only the violence that the US does directly, it's also the indirect violence, because our #1 industrial export right now is what? Weapons. And when your #1 export is weapons, your #1 global marketing strategy is endless war. So the US sells weapons, lots and lots of weapons. And the #1 purchaser of US weapons is? No, it's not Israel. Saudi Arabia, that's right. Now think of how absurd and how obscene this is. Saudi Arabia, a country that is #1 in beheadings in the world, a country that treats women as minors their entire lives, the only country in the world where women are not even allowed to drive, a country that exports extremism, Wahhabism, the distorted form of Islam that is exported around the world thanks to the petrodollars that the Saudis have. The Saudis, who got involved in the internal affairs of Yemen, dropping bombs since March of last year that have killed thousands of people, thousands of innocent people, have taken that poor country of Yemen to the extreme of a humanitarian crisis. With our weapons, including cluster bombs banned by the international community that makes us complicit in war crimes. The Saudis are #1 purchaser of weapons. The #1 recipient of US military money is Israel. Another major human rights violator, an apartheid state that on a daily basis is oppressing the Palestinian people. That state is the #1 recipient of our tax dollars to the tune of $3 billion a year, but that's not enough for the Israeli government. In fact, to give their okay to the Iran nuclear deal, they said you must sweeten this by giving billions more to us. They wanted $5 billion. Obama said, let's go for $4 billion. We're at $4 billion, negotiations still going on, they want more. This is where our tax dollars go, this is where our weapons go. #2 recipient, military aid, Egypt, an extreme violator of human rights that came to power through a coup. And it's not enough to sell those weapons overseas. Those weapons manufacturers, those greedy weapons manufacturers that Pope Francis said have blood on their hands, are also looking for more internal markets. They look at the 18,000 police departments in the United States and they want to sell their weapons and their tanks, their assault rifles, their grenade launchers, their drones. They want to sell them right here in our communities to put down our own people, particularly poor people of color who are the victims of the militarization of our police forces. So here we have a war economy out of control, a military-industrial complex out of control, and a peace movement that has been incapable of striking fear into those in power and moving them away from this military-industrial complex. So let's recognize that another place we have to put blame for all of this is ourselves, for not being capable of building the kind of movement that we need, the effective movement to put pressure in the places where we need to put it. So now we look at the opportunities that we have. Well, when Obama came in, our peace movement died. We had a strong peace movement under Bush. Obama came in, people said, oh, that peace president is going to take care of it. He obviously didn't. Well, fool me once, what did George Bush say? Don't fool me again. I think one positive thing we can say about a prospect of either a Hillary Clinton or a Donald Trump presidency is we will be not fooled again. There are no illusions that either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton are going to be the peace presidents that we need. There is no illusion that they are going to get us out of the endless wars. It's interesting that Donald Trump has said a couple of interesting things, hasn't he? Like that NATO is obsolete. It's a great thing to say. It certainly is obsolete. He even said that he would talk to Kim Jong-un of North Korea. It's a positive thing to say. But let's not be fooled by Donald Trump. And remember, at the heart of his campaign is the Islamophobia that he's been preaching, is the anti-immigrant hatred that he has been preaching. He's even said that he would bring back torture Do whatever you have to do. So Donald Trump is certainly not going to be a peace president. But that gives us the opening, because people will be ready to protest. In fact, just yesterday in DC, we protested at the opening of Hillary Clinton's offices. And it was quite amusing because we went as billionaires for Hillary. We went as, with signs that says, I make weapons, I love Hillary, Wall Street loves Hillary. And we stood outside as the mayor of Washington, D.C. went in, as different officials went in, and they looked at us in kind of horror as we said, we are the 1%, we want Hillary for president. And Hillary, she's our gal, take our corporate money now. But the workers who were working for those officials came out and said to us, thank you for being here. We agree with you 100%. There are lots of people that agree with us and that are happy to see us protesting already from the get-go about Hillary taking money from Wall Street, about Hillary representing the weapons industry, about Hillary taking $10 million from the Saudis as part of her Clinton Foundation. These are things that have to be exposed. Whether or not Hillary Clinton makes it to the White House, we need these movements to pressure her. And the other thing we need to do is build an alternative to the war economy that does not depend on who is in the White House. And let me just say, on building this alternative economy, it's a couple of things, and one is happening already on a very wide scale, which is called the localized economy. I'm sure that many of you are part of it. Instead of investing in the big banks, you invest in credit unions. Instead of buying from factory farms, you buy from local farmers and organic farms. Instead of buying from sweatshops, you buy from thrift stores. Instead of crass consumption, you reuse and you recycle. Instead of buying fracked oil, you buy your energy from solar and wind. This is the kind of economy we have to build, and from the war economy, we have to convert from the top down. Remember conversion? It was a big thing during the 70s and 80s. We have to bring back the whole idea of economic conversion, where we take these militaries and bases and the factories and turn them into the wind farms we need, turn them into the solar farms we need. Instead of Aegis destroyers that are floating in the Gulf, we should turn them into floating hospitals that are going to take care of the refugees and the people who are fleeing from the wars that we start and the people who are fleeing from the natural disasters from the climate crisis. This is what we need to turn the war economy into. And so I want to end by saying that we have a tremendous opportunity to show that whether it's Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, they represent an economy that's built on competition. We want one that's built on cooperation. Instead of one that's built on constant growth that destroys the future, we want one built on sustainability. Instead of one built on us versus them, we want one that's built on interconnectiveness. Instead of one that judges success by wealth, like Donald Trump, from casinos to luxury hotels to how many golf courses he's built, we want ones that are measured by healthy communities and healthy ecosystems. We want a vision that engages and inspires and unites people from the Black Lives Matter movement, the immigrant rights movement, the peace movement, the environmental movement, the labor rights, the artists, the students, to say that we will only give peace a chance when we challenge those in power and replace the war economy with a local peace economy. Thank you.
Friends, very happy to be here. I said very glad to be here, especially at this time, because though we're talking about the presidential candidates, Senator Clinton and Donald Trump, what has really been exciting, watching what is going on from afar in the United States, has been these huge mobilizations of young people in favor of a candidate who talks of socialism. Now, and what I want to tell you is that this movement of young people, which has brought many more people together than one could have imagined, much larger than any political campaign I remember involving trying to go for it against the mainstream, than at any other time in recent American history. The anti-Vietnam War movement didn't create a political side to it, even though Martin Luther King was talking of running as an alternative president, not inside the Democratic Party, but together with Dr. Spock, challenging the Democratic Party. That didn't happen. One reason it didn't happen is he was killed. So what we are witnessing is a very interesting radicalization, and it's a radicalization of young people which is happening in most countries in Europe today. Why? Since the 2008 Wall Street crash, many people felt, especially those who had absolutely no idea or no alternative view, that somehow the governors of the world, the rulers of this world, capitalist world, would manage to put something new in place that would give some comfort to the poor and to the young, who suffer even more on many levels. Lack of housing, too much to pay for education, and increasingly in some parts of Europe, health as well. Though we have national health services, they are under very heavy fire and attack from American health corporations who are increasingly being given contracts by state-owned health services as part of the neoliberal system. So in this situation, it was felt that if the elites who rule the world were a bit more rational, they would attempt to put in place something different, something that had been tried before. It didn't happen. And after a short wait, you had the emergence of new popular movements from the left, and you had the emergence of mass movements from the right. This process began in different ways in different countries, but we can now see a pattern, as we can see in the United States too. And this pattern is as follows. You have had, the only country where you don't have a far-right movement is Spain, because the left have been very dominant in Spanish society, in Spanish political culture, but the Conservative Party in that country, the so-called Popular Party, has been moving further and further to the right itself. And all these movements had one thing in common. They developed from the grassroots. They developed often in one part of the country, either a region, Sicily in the case of the Five-Star Movement, Madrid in the case of the occupation of the squares in Spain, and then spread rapidly from there to the rest of the country. We've been witnessing now, even as I speak, the rise of a new popular movement in France, again a movement which pushes all the established political parties to one side and says, we don't trust you. Or the intellectuals who serve these parties, we don't trust you. Keep away, move away. And we want to unite with trade unions to fight against the new laws that the French socialist government, so-called, is bringing and putting onto the statute book to restrict labor rights in France. And this movement comes together at night. Some of them work during the day. Others think it's a nice time to do it, to occupy the night. La nuit debout, the night rising. And they meet, and increasingly this movement, which started in Paris, is spreading and has spread to other parts of France. There have been clashes with the riot police, etc., etc. In Britain, the radicalization took a different form. Much to everyone's surprise, something odd happened. And what happened was that in order to reduce the power of the trade unions and the labor movement inside the Labour Party, the Labour right was pushing for a virtual primary system, but different, that anyone who was a Labour supporter and paid £3 could join the Labour Party and participate in the election for the leadership of this party. That's how it happened. They assumed that, like in France, this would benefit the right, because people on the right generally assume that most people are like them. In Britain, this turned out not to be the case. Once this rule came into effect, and one of the candidates was Jeremy Corbyn, a long-time socialist, a long-time supporter of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, a long-time campaigner against the wars in the Middle East, a long-time defender of Palestinian rights, who had said for decades that the Trident nuclear missiles in Britain should be got rid of. He said all this in his campaigning for the Labour Party leadership. And they had to broadcast this on television. Unlike here, they couldn't pick and choose, because if the other candidates were on, he had to be on. And lots of young people who hadn't heard these things before, never heard of them. And he said that one of the things he would do if he was elected a leader of the Labour Party would be to renationalize the railway networks, would be to end privatization of education, and would be to end all fees that students have been forced to pay for higher education. Within weeks, 200,000 people had paid their £3 and joined the Labour Party. I didn't do it out of principle, but many of my friends did. And they voted, to the astonishment of the media, which had been denouncing him as a crazy, as a loony, as a nut, who, living in a different world, a dinosaur. Well, he got elected leader of the Labour Party. And that has now created huge problems within the Labour Party and between Corbyn and the establishment. This is in Britain, the so-called motherland of democracy. That a senior military general, serving general, gave an interview to the Sunday Times, one of Rupert Murdoch's papers, saying that if Corbyn was elected Prime Minister of England, there would be mutinies in the army and they would refuse to obey orders. That happened. Another general appeared on a breakfast time television show saying that the decision not to ditch the Trident nuclear missiles was unacceptable, would weaken Britain's defenses, and Corbyn was not suitable as a Prime Minister. So when a conservative grandee was asked, what the hell is going on? Can't you control the army? This is unheard of in Britain. He said, oh, well, technically, of course, the Queen is the commander-in-chief of the army. So I wrote at the time, that's fine then. We all want to live under a banana monarchy. Because that's what they're saying. So the campaign against Corbyn has been huge, and so far things have been proceeding not too badly. Attempts to force him to retreat on Trident have failed. Attempts to force him to retreat on other things have so far failed. And his popularity is slowly growing. And attempts to remove him as leader of the Labour Party, opinion poll after opinion poll shows if they did that and he stood again, he would get larger majorities as leader. Now, in Spain, a mass popular movement, Podemos, organized itself as a loose party, a party movement, a movement party, not a traditional party, and came within 2 percentage points of defeating the traditional right-wing socialist party in that country. I say this very carefully and cautiously, simply to register that there is anger on the streets and in people's homes, and this is the way they respond. This is the way this generation is responding. Corbyn in Britain, Sanders here, movements challenging social democracy there. What are their demands, effectively, if one is totally frank? What these people are demanding from the rulers and from the bankers who run this world is a little bit of social democracy. Not too much. They're saying we won't ask for too much, but we do want a health system that is not privatized. We do want free education. We want cheap homes, and we want our railways taken back. We don't want all the utilities being privatized. In Ireland, there was a huge struggle against water privatization. So, in these movements, by demanding little, they are attracting huge numbers of people. And the question then comes, is the capitalist state in these countries prepared to accept a government elected on the basis of these demands? The indications are not good, because what we are witnessing effectively is a hollowing out of the democratic process itself, as Chris has been talking about, that they don't care anymore. They don't need to prove that they are Democrats to anyone. Gone are the days of the Cold War when the idea of giving more space to dissidents in the media was necessary to show the communist world, look, we are better than you. That's all gone. They don't need to prove it. And they feel they can do what they want. And when there's resistance, they try, their initial reaction is to try and crush it ideologically, saying you are Putin's agents, or you're working for terrorism, or you're doing this, or you're in the grip of Islam. By the way, the country in Europe which is the most Islamophobic, much more so than the US, is France. Horrific. Absolutely horrific. Islamophobia has infected a large chunk of their intellectuals. When the kids in the banlieues, the suburbs, struggle, very few white organizations off the left come in support of them. You can name 3 or 4 intellectuals who defend them. So Islamophobia is huge. I was in France before I came here. And whenever I was interviewed, the shock and horror when they said, once at a public event, not unlike this, about 5 or 6 people said, and you now have a Muslim mayor in London? I said, I know, France is in a state of shock. But we're in a state of shock because he's a very right-wing mayor. He completely defends corporate interests. He is completely opposed to what Jeremy Corbyn stands for. And he is cozying up to those who attacked him, the conservatives. So it's big for you that we have a Muslim mayor, but we judge him not by his skin color or his religion, but by his politics and by what he's going to do. That is our definition. Because, you know, this is not a big deal in Britain. Lots of members of parliament not lots, but a fair amount, are Muslims of Muslim origin. A conservative member of the cabinet, the business secretary, no less, is of Muslim origin. The former chairperson of the Conservative Party, who resigned as chairperson, Baroness Warsi, is a Muslim, and they come, like the new mayor, from humble backgrounds. You know, their fathers were first-generation migrants. So it's a huge mistake to fall into the trap of thinking that automatically identity is, the politics of identity are progressive. Sometimes they are, as obviously in Black Lives Matter. It's a huge movement and a very welcome movement, and a movement which is broken with all the opportunist black politicians who hung on the coattails of Democrat politicians. That's the most important thing about Black Lives Matter. But the case of Asian politicians in Europe is very different. So each has to be judged according to their politics and what they do when they come to power. I just want to speak briefly about which Medea has already done very eloquently, about the state of the Middle East. You know, this is a part of the world that was made into what it is after the First World War, when the British and French armies went in and created these small states. Prior to this, the Middle East was one area, the Arab world, and dominated by large cities, under the rule of the Ottomans, a very loose form of rule, by the way. So that you could go to school in Amman, in Jordan, you could go to a better school, secondary school in Jerusalem, and you could get your university degree in Cairo or Damascus. That's how that world used to function. Then came the First World War and the division of the Middle East, the Arab East, into little states. And British civil servants, imperial civil servants, used to boast when asked, how did you draw the borders of Iraq? And Gertrude Bell, the civil servant in question, she said, with a stick in the sand. That's how we did it. Now we are witnessing a new imperial process carried out by this empire, whose citizens you all are, of redividing the Middle East, and even a more reactionary fashion. The invasion of Iraq, what did it effectively do? By destroying the previous state completely, something they didn't do in Japan after the Second World War, something they didn't do in Italy after the Second World War, where 60 to 70% of fascist personnel in the armed forces, the police, the judiciary were retained. That they didn't even do fully in Germany, in West Germany. 20 to 30% of the previous personnel, including the chiefs of the intelligence services of the Third Reich, were retained by the United States to fight the new Cold War. But Iraq, completely different. Destroy every single remnant of the old state. Hand over power to Shiite clerical parties. And the result has been a disaster. A disaster. Nearly 2 million people killed during the occupation of Iraq. 5 million orphans. Millions of refugees in neighboring countries. And the war in Iraq, which we were told was over, now more troops are being sent in to fight ISIS, which was created by the first war in the first place, has gone on longer than the First World War, longer than the Second World War. The wars in Afghanistan have gone on longer than the last Vietnam Wars, and longer than the First and Second World Wars. And you know, when a country is occupied, however it's occupied, it has a deeply damaging effect on the psyche of all its people, regardless of which religious faction they come from. And this is now what is happening. Very few people think that Iraq can survive as a state. Northern Iraq, the Kurdish areas, are already an American-Israeli protectorate and function as such. The Iranians control Shiite Iraq. The Saudis, through ISIS, are trying to control another part of Iraq. So the old Iraq that remained united, for good or for bad, since the First World War, is about to be divided again. Syria, virtually the same thing is going on there. Because it is in the interests of the empire and its close allies in the region, Saudi Arabia and Israel, to divide them into little tiny statelets which can be controlled from outside. Hence, the destruction of the Iraqi army was considered vital. It was one of the last sovereign states. Hence, the destruction of Syria, regardless of the absurdities or even crimes of their rulers, has to be destroyed to destroy any states which have sovereignty. That is not permitted in this day and age. Afghanistan is a complete and utter mess. And as some of us argued when they first went in, this war is going to go into Pakistan, and it has done, wrecking the social fabric of that country. And the drone attacks don't help. You know, there was a remarkable situation some years ago when the Iranian government, which was then considered a top-level enemy government, a policeman fighting against demonstrators, which was of course wrong, accidentally killed a young girl. Everyone admits it wasn't deliberate, as happens here all the time. It was an accident. Obama emerged in the White House lawn trying to squeeze out a tear. The American press went absolutely crazy. And the headlines, and that very same day in Pakistan, a drone attack had killed 56 women and children when they targeted a school by mistake. Not a mention in most Western newspapers. And it is these double standards that drive people mad and crazy, and they want revenge. It's not too difficult to understand why many young Muslims are going in this direction. To be frank, I'm surprised that there are not more. One should be pleased there are not more. Because given the extent of the provocation, this is what they want to do. Take revenge, saying, why can they get away with killing us? Why shouldn't we do the same? And of course, one argues sometimes against this when I'm confronted with it. But you people are, you don't know how to fight, etc., etc. They say that. So, in such a situation, what are we going to do? Well, in the United States, of course, those of you who live here know better than me. But again, watching it from afar, I think the model which Medea has outlined, local strength, building local grassroots, I would add to that, building political bases locally and on a statewide level before expending our energies on a national campaign. That's what the left is capable of doing. The Seattle example is a very good one. When an excellent campaign by a socialist, Sama Savant, has resulted in her winning at the elections again to the council, despite heavy democratic action against her and the Democrats trying to find a candidate of color, etc. They won. It's a good model. And one shouldn't sit back, one shouldn't sit back and do nothing and wait. And that is the encouraging thing. I have to be honest with you, when I read some opinion poll which said that 30% of those who've been supporting Bernie have said that they will not, under any circumstances, vote for Hillary Clinton. I think that's positive. We live in a very strange world, a world of transition in which the system that is in place is not working. Everyone knows it's not working. We know it's not working, and those who run the system know it's not working. Because were it working even a tiny bit, then all these jokers in Wall Street, the bankers who stole money, half of them would be in prison for what they did. That's what happened in a tiny little place called Iceland. You heard of Iceland? They locked up most of the bankers involved in deals like this and said, you go to prison for stealing from your own people. That's what happened. But in the countries, the large countries, none of this has taken place. And while on the subject of crime and punishment, who has been punished for the war in Iraq? No one. I mean, at the very least, the United States should offer one person to be tried at the criminal court. And that could be Dick Cheney. He'd be a popular choice as war criminal. So laws that supposedly apply to others do not apply to the United States or its allies. And we're in a situation where it's become virtually impossible for mainstream parties and even some left groups and left parties. Only the Italian parties are saying withdrawal from NATO. We don't want to be part of a military alliance. The Labour Party in Britain isn't, not even Corbyn. Podemos isn't, saying we should quit NATO. So there are lots of problems, but this transition also offers solutions. And these solutions are in flux at the moment. There are left futures ahead. We see them, in small ways in different parts of the world, though there have been defeats here and there. But I think that we are also on the eve of change in some shape or form, because the only other choice that exists is that of the extreme right, which is much, much stronger than us all over Western Europe and North America, particularly in this country. So we have to do something, we have to organize, we have to fight back, and on every possible level. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much to our different panelists who spoke. We are going to do a quick Q&A, just a few questions.
Wait. Here, we're going to talk here just a little bit.
Right, okay.
Then we'll take like 3 questions, but they need to come right to the front right here.
Yes.
All right, just while people are moving around, some quick comments. I had a question for you, Chris, about surveillance and what function you think the surveillance state is, what function it's serving, particularly what function it is serving vis-a-vis our social movements.
When your government watches you 24 hours a day, which our government is doing, you cannot use the word liberty. That is the relationship between a master and a slave.
All right, hold one sec, Chris. Folks, if you're leaving, please, you need to respect the conversation is continuing. So please keep your conversation to outside the hall. People at the back, pipe down.
The fact is...
And I should say, I really am only taking 3 questions, and they're not going to be from 3 white men.
So,
Work it out amongst yourselves, but I don't see any women here.
the problem is that the corporate elites have created a system through militarized police, the evisceration of civil liberties, wholesale surveillance, and this has already been completed in marginal communities, where rights have essentially become privileges, and privileges, as Hannah Arendt, again going back to Arendt, once rights become privileges in a society, then they can be taken away. They have created the perfect system of wholesale surveillance and oppression within communities of color, which have been effectively demonized by a corporate media and a political class. And the consequence is that when the rest of the population becomes as restive, all of the mechanisms are in place at the flick of a switch, so that we begin to suffer the excesses of power that we are culpable for because we did not stand up for poor people of color when the Constitution was being shredded in front of their face.
A question for you, Medea. One of the aspects of this evening's panel has been this question of humanity's peril. All this militarism, all this capitalism is putting humanity at peril. You travel. I know it sounds sappy, but I really don't mean it. I mean it in an inspiringly useful way. Where do you see humanity being reclaimed or claimed in the context of all of this? You have stories. How do we rebuild our humanity?
I see it in the challenges that people on the ground are making to the oppression. If you take the example of Israel, the fact that throughout the world there is this very vibrant boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is very inspiring. And when you hear Hillary Clinton say that BDS is evil and encourages students in their campuses to fight against it, I think that just is going to inspire in the fall a tremendous movement on our campuses. And I think our young people are going to show us how they can stand up against Hillary Clinton's bullying.
Tariq, I have a media question, but before that I have a question about Ireland. I had the great pleasure of being back in Ireland for the first time in many, many years recently on assignment for the Nation magazine, and I was there for the 100th anniversary of the so-called Easter Rising, 1916. The first armed rebellion against colonial rule of the 20th century, I think. And what was so striking to me was it's 100 years, right? So there have been many anniversaries. In every instance, until this one, the main thrust of the debate, in Ireland anyway, was whether the uprising was justified, whether the civilian deaths could be justified, how long had this delayed independence for. The southern state, the Irish state, had laid it on very heavy, and the debate had taken place in a very far, I would say, a very conservative part of the spectrum politically. This time, the complete opposite. Most people claiming the legacy not just of the rebels, but of the left flank of the rebels, particularly the James Connollys, those who talked about socialism, of anti-nationalism, fighting empire. You saw a lot of focus on the women rebels, who at the same time were nurses and doctors, but also snipers and fighters. My question to you is, one of the things I saw happening in Ireland that was exciting was just about every school child had been asked to write their own proclamation for 2016, and been asked to consider what would their republic of the 21st century look like. I wonder to what extent you see exercises like this happening in the countries that you're talking about, or if you have any suggestions of how we can go about really visualizing the future that we want to make. Because presumably we need to start making it now rather than waiting for someone to hand it down to us.
Well, the Irish situation, the 1916 anniversary took place at a time where Ireland is confronting a huge economic crisis, and where the European Union has imposed on it a set of laws which do not allow the Irish to carry out any spending without permission from Brussels, including on culture. And this is felt, of course, all over the country. Secondly, the European Union rules insist on privatization, which is what their economists have been advising the Irish. The water privatization, the defeat of it by a mass popular movement, brought about the fall of the government, which was huge. Secondly, a number of radical left-wing socialist candidates have been elected for the first time in Northern Ireland to the Belfast Parliament, a group called People Before Profits. Two of their main campaigners were elected to Parliament. Likewise, the water campaigners and other radicals have been elected into the Parliament in Dublin and are playing a very good role by refusing to take sides in the old wars between the Irish political parties. Look, Ireland has a very special history, as you know, Laura, and each country has to rely and depend on its own history and the precedents in these countries and bring them back to life. Here, of course, you know, very few people talk about the slave rebellions or of the groups of small groups but important groups of whites who helped these rebellions in the past. In Britain, no one ever talks about the examples of the English Revolution. After all, England was the first country to execute its monarchs. I remember saying this in Australia just as a throwaway line, and the whole audience started applauding. And then I remembered that
Maybe they didn't.
lot of Irish people had gone there.
I don't think they heard what you said. Say it again. England was the first country
England was the first country which decided, after a trial, to execute the king. And the French did it later, of course, and then the Russians followed. And in the United States, I think that event, the English Revolution, played a big part, because a lot of the Puritans who'd come to the States before the English Revolution did have certain radical traditions. Many of them forgot those, but they existed. And that must have played a part in preventing those who wanted the United States to become a monarchy, because there were some amongst the founding fathers who were keen on that, and that was reduced. So I think, you know, to answer your question, each country has elements in its past which are heroic, as the 1916 Easter Uprising, and they have to develop them. It's a good idea.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. I said I would take 3, and I wouldn't take them all from men, so let's do 1, 2, first 3. Just kind of have to shout, and I'll restate your question. It has to have a question mark at the end. Yeah. So your question?
There's 1 million people under siege. What does the panel think of the slogan, drug food, not bombs, airlifts to people under siege?
All right, so that's a good question. What does the panel think of the slogan, drop food, not bombs, airlifts to people under siege in relation to Syria? Medea?
I think it's a great slogan. We were just in Congress this week with those very signs. And I agree that we have to say to our government that it is not doing its part to make sure humanitarian aid gets to the besieged communities in Syria, and it certainly is not doing its part to allow Syrian refugees into this country. We should be taking in over 100,000. The goal of 10,000 is ridiculous, and we've only taken in 1,300, which is shameful.
All right, can you do as well with a question mark at the end?
Yes.
Yes.
Would you please express the parallels between prison-industrial complex and military-industrial complex?
What are the parallels between the prison-industrial complex and the military-industrial complex? Thank you. Good, sharp question. Chris.
Go into any inner city school, and you can see that these kids are being conditioned for two routes, both of which essentially rip from their freedom, and that is the prison or the military. Those are the options. Recruiters are all over poor neighborhoods. And when you are in the school to prison pipeline, you're surrounded by guards, you're going through metal detectors, increasingly in charter schools. You are disciplined as if you were in the military. And of course, discipline inside a prison replicates discipline inside military structures. And so, yes, it's a very important question, because with the loss of manufacturing jobs, the rise of surplus labor, the staggering amounts of unemployment, 50% for black youth, higher if we count underemployment, they are being trained to either be cannon fodder or locked in cages.
Anybody else want to comment on that? No. Next question. We don't have one, but come up here, we'll help you. Go for it. What's your question? I'll help.
My question is,
You-
panel and everybody, so you too can hear, the Constitution and George Washington and Alexander Hamilton set up public banks
So the Constitution set up public banks.
that was owned by the public. Do you know, and what are we doing, and what does the panel think about reconstituting public banks?
All right, so the Constitution.
One corollary is it is the banks who print the dollars. The Federal Reserve is not a government entity. They are, the people on the reserve are appointed by the bankers.
All right, I've got a recommendation for you.
What do you think about resuming the public bank? This is my question about
Thank you. What do you think about reconstituting the public banks? And I would encourage you to take a look at a very good episode of the Laura Flanders Show where we talked about exactly that and democratizing the Fed. So,
I agree that that's something that's absolutely necessary in building a peace economy. And we have actually, as Code Pink, a new peace economy program. We have sign-up sheets that's been going around here. If you haven't had a chance to see it, please come up after and sign up so we can work together to build public banks, to build public institutions, and to build the kind of localized economy that will take the power away from the corporations.
Tariq, let me get you to come in on this. As I understand it, the Labour Party under Corbyn has actually pledged some public money to these kinds of initiatives, worker cooperatives in particular.
Yeah, they have done that, but between pledging them and winning an election and coming to power, who knows what's going to happen? You know, one has to be realistic about that, because the pledges Corbyn has made, some of them are very huge. There's going to be a big fight to renationalize the railway system in the country, which is a very popular demand supported by between 60 and 80% of the population. And this has been the case for many decades. He's the first political leader who said we're going to do it. The EU is going to fight him, saying it challenges some of the competition rules in the EU. The Conservative Party and half the Blairites in his own party. So on every single thing there's going to be a huge struggle, and if it's just left to Parliament and debates in Parliament, it won't get through anything. You have to have big mass movements, popular movements from below, like the movement that finally elected him, to be kept up, to maintain support. Without them, I think it's going to be difficult.
All right, I need to take a group conscience here. We had said 3 questions. Shall I take 3 more? Yeah. All right, 3 more. Quick, come on up.
When Germany gives a so-called bailout or a loan to Greece, is that added to the principle?
When Germany gives a bailout to Greece, is that added to the principle? Question.
Well, it is. And most of these bailouts given to Greece, they are not bailouts. It's money given to Greece so they can pay back the interest on what they borrowed before. Very little of that money actually goes to the Greek people, who are suffering real privations at the moment. I cannot even begin to describe how awful the situation in Greece is. When the Greek people wanted change, 61% of them voted to break with all these measures. They strengthened their government. Unfortunately, their government capitulated to the European Union.
Quickly, I'm not sure if anyone is in the line wants to ask this question, but I want to make sure that we do get each of you to respond just briefly to the question of what is happening in Latin America right now. Destabilization in Argentina, Venezuela, Brazil. We haven't mentioned this so far, but I don't want to have the evening close without getting there.
Well, I think we have 2 sort of associated phenomena. One is that the State Department, i.e. the United States, has been trying to weaken, destabilize the Bolivarian governments, the progressive governments in South America, ever since they came into office. So that is nothing new, and they weren't able to do it. And one reason why they are able to do it, as the decline in the price of basic commodities, i.e. oil in the case of Venezuela, has meant a huge economic crisis in that country, which they haven't been able to tackle. It's not easy. I mean, though some of the good advice was rejected. Similarly, in Argentina. So you have now constitutional attempts to topple Maduro before his term is over, a constitutional coup against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, and an electoral victory for a total and complete rogue in Argentina. Argentina is well on the way to becoming the first hedge fund republic in South America.
Thank you. All right, quick question from you.
Just as capitalism emerged from feudalism, right now there are workers, producer cooperatives that are emerging.
Question.
The problem is the system, and the system is capitalism. All the reforms,
Your question.
all the movements. My question is, do you see that the approach of workers, producer, self-organized cooperatives on the model of Mondragon in the Basque Country, that really this is the future because it confronts and it deals with the issue of the system,
All right, great question.
which is capitalism? Question mark.
Thank you.
So,
Do worker cooperatives help?
so I think this has a lot to do with the last question about the public banks, because you need public banks to be able to give out loans to worker cooperatives, because the commercial banks are not going to do that kind of thing. And you need worker cooperatives to have decentralized power. And I think when I talked about a localized peace economy, that's what we're talking about, is new ways of organizing. So thank you for bringing that up. And once again, if you want to work with us at Code Pink, come and talk to us. Jody Evans right here is in charge of our local peace economy campaign, and we need more folks to work with us.
Right. And I would just say exactly these kinds of topics of worker democracy, of transformation of the workplace, and of relations of production and distribution and consumption are the sorts of things we talk about on a weekly basis on the Laura Flanders Show. So check it out. All right, the three of you, come on up here. Our friend with the co-op question modeled a fascinating initiative. Okay, quick. I'm going to hold this. You're going to come up with a great question.
Oh,
Yep.
well, the first thing I want to say is, in this society right now, a white male is not necessarily white, and they are not necessarily male, and I don't think the white males that are here are the ones that we are against. So in the interest of unity, I want the white males to know that they are equal to what I would have to say. Now, my other question is, 90% of my students are pro Bernie Sanders. I got the feeling that he was written off, yet I've never seen Hillary Clinton as threatened as she is right now, and she even just said that she would consider Bernie Sanders as her vice president. So, what I'm saying is, why is there a feeling, whether you're pro or against Bernie Sanders, that he's to be sort of written off to be in a position of power and control, even if you don't agree with everything he says?
All right, good question about Bernie. Come on, your question, and then we'll get answers from our panelists. We're going to get answers.
I'm just curious what we all think about how do we get beyond geopolitics of separation and competition into like a unified planetary synergy, and like what is beyond this paradigm of political struggle on a global scale?
All right, and the last one.
Yes, this is on the subject of surveillance. People talk about using encryption to protect our data, but the NSA has methods of surveillance that you can't encrypt. They have a grid of space satellites with interferometry that's 3D holographically scan our homes, brains in effect, and my friend in the Department of Defense works for them. DrRobertDuncan.com has info from him. He claims they're spying on us, and they've attacked people with radiation. We want to know what we could do to get this stopped and get people covering this issue. And NSA whistleblower William Binney and Russell Tice support us, and we have videos of them on the site backing us as victims.
So three sort of macro questions there. One about what are we writing off Bernie Sanders given what sort of a threat he seems to be posing to Hillary Clinton? Two, what do we do to get onto a more harmonically convergent sphere and plane? And three, what do we do about the possibility that we're being spied on?
Well, let me address the issue of Bernie Sanders, because I don't write Bernie Sanders off. In fact, with Shama, she and I encourage Bernie to run as an independent, and Shama now has a petition up. What's the called? Shama? There's a petition she has up calling on Bernie to run as an independent. So no, far from writing Sanders off, I think that both Shama and I were concerned from the beginning that he would be strangled by the Democratic establishment as he has been, and that we have to begin to build. And if we are encouraging Sanders to revoke, given the fact that the election was stolen from him, revoke his commitment to support Clinton, and with his agenda and the money that he's raised and the enthusiasm that he's raised, step outside the system and begin to build a movement. So I'm not writing Sanders off.
Following up on that, I think I was reading the Washington Post the other day, and it had a screaming headline that said, "The majority of millennials have a more favorable view of socialism than capitalism." That is quite astounding, and that is thanks to Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders has done something amazing for a young generation that treats this old curmudgeon like a rock star. And they are taking in what he said, and they are going to use it in different ways, and that is to build a different system in this country. So nobody, I don't think, here is writing off Bernie Sanders. We say, thank you, Bernie, for the opening that you've given to a lot of people, especially the young generation, and let's be inspired by that and hopeful that they are going to say socialism is the way we want to go, and we're going to build it in a 21st century that fits what we want in the United States, and that's very exciting.
I think harmony and convergence is left for you, Tariq.
No, I want to say a few things about Bernie too. Because the campaign's having a huge impact globally. People can't believe what they're watching on the web, not on their television screens, but certainly on the web, is these huge mobilizations. And it would be a big tragedy for the United States if these mobilizations simply disappeared once Hillary gets it. I think she has got it. There's no point in pretending she hasn't. I mean, if she didn't, I'd be delighted. But I think she has. So the big question is, you build a movement, an important movement, a democratic movement, a movement which talks about socialism, about dealing with the banks, but we can't, for the future, limit this movement to the electoral cycle of US politics. Something needs to be done. And it will happen if that's what the kids want to happen. And I note that the young generation, today's generation, has no problem with dinosaurs. Either here you have Bernie, or in Britain where we have Jeremy Corbyn. Both of them are virtually the same age. And that is not what's affecting people. What is attracting them is the ideas which they are putting forward, which many people respond to. The question is how to take these movements further. As for the synergy, I mean, look, the Bolivarians in South America tried very hard, and while Hugo Chavez was alive, succeeded to a certain extent when the oil prices were right. He said, any government in South America which wants to build a health service, which wants to build cheap houses for workers and the poor, which wants to create doctors in its own society, there is a blank check. Here you are, go and do it. And things were moving in that direction, with various bodies, economic bodies being formed, etc. That is now in a state of collapse, tragically. But the ideas are still there, and people won't forget them. That's the important thing to remember. Lots of people remember the good things that happened and the good things that were done, and when the mood is right, they will come back to them. And one of these was to try and unite the South American continent, both against the big brother in the north and for the interests of the people in the south. And they may, I mean, Simon Bolivar couldn't do it. He said it's like plowing the sea. But Chavez got a few steps beyond Bolivar in that, and they actually began to do it. So, you know, one can't give up simply because they're going through a bad period.
Medea wanted to say one more thing.
I just wanted to add one other thing that Bernie Sanders has done. It has, before Bernie Sanders, been just impossible for any leading candidates to talk about Palestine in a way that is in any way sympathetic. And the fact that Bernie Sanders has brought that up and says that's going to be a fight in the Democratic platform, he's not going to say what a lot of us would like to say, which is cut off every cent to that repressive apartheid regime. He's going to say we want an even-handed approach, but you know, that is miles ahead of what we have had.
Final comment, Chris?
I think the power of Sanders is that he gave or verbalized the reality around us in a way that other politicians, including Barack Obama, have not done. Economic inequality. That's a fact. It's a fact that most Americans can see every day. And that is a huge breakthrough. On the other hand, I think Sanders, and his voting record backs this up, doesn't understand that you cannot be a socialist unless you are an anti-imperialist. That imperialism is the mechanism that creates centralized control that serves the dictates of empire at the expense of the citizenry. And that it is not just militarism in terms of, as Medea pointed out, that is financially disemboweling the country, but it is also, and both parties are guilty of this, creating an ideology, one where we deify the military, we deify systems of internal security. And the consequence of that is the kind of proto-fascism that we are seeing now in Trump rallies. And I'm looking for a candidate that, and of course it's political suicide, as George McGovern found out, or earlier Henry Wallace found out, but I'm looking for a radical candidate that understands that the first step on the road to socialism is the destruction of American imperialism.
Chris Hedges, Medea Benjamin, Tariq Ali, thank you all three. Have a great forum, everybody. See you tomorrow, bright and early.